Arriving at Aurich Airport, Germany, a transport plane brings the first of the German war criminals to be tried by a Canadian military court. Brigade Führer Kurt Meyer, an officer of the former Waffen SS, goes on trial in the Normandy building. Kept under close arrest, Meyer is allowed out of his cell only for brief periods of exercise. He is charged with ordering Canadian prisoners of war shot while in his custody.
On June 6, 1944, the 7th and 8th Brigades of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division landed on Juno Beach and started pushing inwards. And following up their assault was the 9th Brigade. Now, the 9th Brigade of the Canadian 3rd was linking up basically on their left with the 9th of the British, and they were pushing as far south as what they could. So the area where I'm standing now, if you look off in the distance, you have Caen over there. The Canadians would have been pushing up in this area, and I don't know if you can really tell. I mean, I would think that you could, but this is flat right here. A lot is made of the hedgerows and the bocage in Normandy, you know, in the Utah Beach area. But I'm telling you what, as an outdoorsman, if I'm hunting, I would rather hunt over there than on this flat ground, because here any kind of movement can be seen. So there's really very little cover and concealment. Well, what happened on D-Day is that the British 9th ended up getting held up over here towards Caen. The Canadian 9th didn't know it and started advancing forward, and what they didn't know is they were about ready to stick their heads into the buzzsaw of the 12th SS Panzer Division. All right, so the direction that I'm looking in now is facing to the south, and this is the route that the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division, or the 9th Brigade, would have advanced along on their basically objective to capture the Carpiquet Airport. And right here, there's a monument to what is now referred to as Hell's Corner. And if you'll notice there, it's in French, and I'm not fluent in French, but I know enough to know that says the 7th of June 1944, 7th of July 1944. The Canadians are going to be going through here twice. So they're going to move through on June the 7th. They're going to run into the 12th SS Panzer Division and get pushed back, and then they're going to have to retake this very spot on July the 7th. And this was the site of some pretty fierce fighting. You think of, World War I being places where they had no man's land. This was no man's land during the Battle of Normandy.
So the Canadian 9th Brigade are coming down this very road towards Carpiquet Airport, which at this point is still about 3 miles south of us, blissfully aware that the reconnaissance elements and one of the regiments of the German 12th SS Division have already reached an abbey on the outskirts of the village of Oti, which we're heading towards, and they are essentially, these Germans, watching this advance. This is unknown to the Canadians, and in fact they're actually, as much as you can on the second day of invasion, enjoying it, because they're not seeing much in the way of German opposition. In fact, just where we're coming now, where these electricity pylons are, was an anti-tank ditch. The Germans had prepared an anti-tank ditch. When the Canadians get to this very point, they find it abandoned. There are literally kind of mess tins bubbling away there with porridge or whatever that the Germans seem to run away from minutes before. And this is causing the Canadians to think that they've got these Germans, whoever they are, on the run. They're falling back towards Berlin. And I'm sure at this moment, the Canadians kind of nudging each other, saying, hey, we'll be in Berlin by tea time at this rate, lads, as they pushed on down there. And to this day, we're not sure whether the Germans had actually baited the trap by having whoever these German defenders were pull back further to encourage this advance, or whether it was a genuine falling back of some German troops. We don't know, but certainly when they get there, there's an abandoned position. Now, we're in the village of Buron now, and Buron has expanded slightly over the years. We have to stop some traffic lights in a minute. So remember, the Canadians are coming down here. Now, they've left Courcelles and Juno Beach lacking in water. They've the water mains in Courcelles were hit during the landings, and they've been going out with like an inch of water in the bottom of their canteens. And as they're coming down on the 7th of June, the sun is beating down them. They're hot. They're wearing wool battle dress. Some are riding on the universal carriers and even in the fronts of some of the tanks. There's Stuart tanks and further behind Sherman tanks. But they're coming down this road and blissfully aware of the fact there's this German ambush waiting for them. It's all comes to a head when we get to the village of Oti. Now, as we go around the corner here, you'll see the sign for Carpiquet Airport. So that's 4.5 kilometers, that's just over 3 miles. So they are, in fact, tantalizingly close to their objective. But as we leave Buron, and this is when JD will be looking forward, because I'm the one driving, we're going to see when we get beyond the trees, the ramparts of the Abbey Ardenne, which was a long-standing, medieval, essentially, French abbey, the towers of which were being used by the Germans to observe this road. And we're just going to go over the speed bump, and then we get the roundabout, and I'll point out to JD where we're looking. It's over there. See the cluster of trees over there? There's a big kind of tall roof. It's going to come into view any second now. There it is. See the building, the big hotel? Well, there, right there. That's the Abbey Ardenne. On the horizon there, and that is where Kurt Meyer, the German commander, is. So these Canadians, they have no idea of this, of course, and they don't know that sitting over there in fields about a mile away from us are Panzer IVs, German anti-tank guns. There's SS infantry, all camouflage in their camouflage smocks inside the field, which have got 2 or 3 foot of wheat, and they're just waiting for the right moment. And as often in tragic stories, it was the victims who in a sense trigger the disaster here, because when they get to the village of Oti, and Oti was a typical French village with a town hall and a church, there was a water pump, and beside the water pump what the French call a lavoir, which is like a square pond where the French would go and wash their clothes back in the day. Remember, I told you how these Canadians have come out of Courcelles with a lack of water in their canteens, and there are Stuart tanks of the Sherbet Fusiliers in with the infantry. And when the infantry, with a really hot one, see the water pump and the lavoir, they say, well, we're just going to fill up our canteens. And the armoured officers say, well, we'll just push on to Carpiquet Airport. And the force of infantry and armour splits. And it was quite possibly at that very moment, remember Kurt Meyer, the German commander, is watching this, that he realises the two forces being split is exactly the right moment to strike. And the Stuart tanks carry on beyond this village. And I think it was 22 tanks or 23 tanks or something like that, and only 2 got beyond about 500 yards of where we are right now, because they were hit in the side by just horrendous amounts of German anti-tank fire from tanks and anti-tank guns in this field. And we're stopping here in Oti, and it's one of the villages that when you're here, if JD was driving through this on his own, unless he happened to see the monument, he wouldn't stop here, because no offence to the good people of Oti, it's not the most attractive of the French villages with all the stone buildings, but from my point of view, one of the most historic, because of the tragedy of what happened in this town square, which we're going to deal with right now for you.
So right now I am in the French village of Oti, and this is the area where the Canadians would have moved through on June the 7th. And there was a watering spot right here where they stopped to get water. The armor moved on and left the infantry behind, and there was something absolutely horrible that took place right here.
So the Canadians are in the advance of the 9th Brigade, elements of the Nova Scotia Highlanders, Stormont, Dundas and Glengarry Highlanders, and some of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers tank units get here. And as they get here, there's a French lavoir, a French water source in the well, and these guys are hot because they'd left Courcelles without enough water in their canteens. So the infantrymen take the opportunity to fill their canteens from the water division there. They start leading their rifles down. It's hot. They take their small packs off. They have no idea there's an ambush there waiting for them. And the tank commanders say, well, Carpiquet Airport's just down the road. We'll push on, fill up your water. We'll catch you up. Well, you'll catch us up, and we'll meet up there. And the Canadian armour carries on down this road. And the first these infantrymen who are filling up their water canteens know about an ambush is they absolutely hear the explosions of Canadian tanks blowing up just a few hundred yards south of here, where in the fields over there to the east are German 12th SS tanks and anti-tank guns and infantrymen with Panzerfaust waiting for them. They've been sitting there, they know the column's coming, and I think only 2 of the 20 odd tanks get more than about 500 yards beyond where we are. Some limp back this way, but the majority, plumes of smoke coming out. So these guys are like, what the hell? As they're reacting to that, through these streets here is where the SS infantry start pouring, and they've been in the wheat fields over there, and they start coming through here, and it's untold carnage, just firing. These Canadians, some of them aren't even armed, but there are other Canadians arriving. In total, we think 84 Canadians died in this square on June the 7th, but 37 of them, and this is where it gets so awful, were killed after having laid their weapons down, because the suddenness of this German ambush has completely derailed this Canadian advance. But it doesn't end there. The Germans on the ground here, the infantrymen, call back 2 or 3 of the German tanks that have made their way up to the road and are now going north towards the beach. And there are dead and wounded Canadians lying in the roads and around where we're standing. And the infantrymen, laughing gleefully, and they're possibly drugged up because they were taking all sorts of stimulants, direct the tank drivers to go back and forth over these dead and wounded in the road. And this is when some of the French villagers who lived around the square, a young guy who I used to meet on my tours, was I think 12 or 13, his elder brother Maurice, who was 15, ran out of his house and starts trying to pull these wounded Canadians off the road and dead Canadians. And he and 5 or 6 French civilians are killed by the SS. And the younger brother, who'd lived here all his life, he told me, I've lived here for generations, this is my village, I go to the same bakery my father went to, my grandfather, we go to the same church, same schools, so I love living here, but on my bad days, he said, I see these streets running red with the blood from dead Canadians that were run over by tanks. And he would say to my groups, however much blood you think comes from a body that's been run over back and forth by a tank, he'd go, it's more than that, he would say, because the weight of 35 tons of Panzer IV and tracks that wide going back and forth over a human body, the result would be terrible.
So right there is the square where Paul was just talking about just these horrific acts that were being carried out by the SS. And if you look over here in this church and cemetery, well, you can see battle damage from this awful thing that took place. So these 12th SS guys, the young guys, 18, 19, 20 years old, and they just start shooting indiscriminately all over the place. If we go up here to this grave marker, you can see some more battle damage. Wow. here on the front of the church just above the door, well, you can see where there's just been all kinds of battle damage where, I mean, these guys, I don't even know what they're shooting at. They're just shooting indiscriminately at anything.
So during the chaotic fighting in the village of Oti, one of the Canadians who was an officer in the artillery, Captain Raymond, was falling back this way and decided to take refuge inside the church. And as he comes in here, he hid inside the confession box, and the story is a couple of SS guys followed him in there, but for whatever reason didn't notice him hiding inside the box there, and his heart was pumping out of his chest, and he was gripping onto kind of inside the molding, the wooden moldings of this box. But sometime later, the Germans had moved on. He was able to find his way back to Juno Beach and his unit. And when he got back there, his friend said, "What's that in your hands, Captain?" And he'd, in kind of panic, in fear, he kind of broken off 2 bits of moulding in his hand and kind of run back with them with his hand kind of gripped around, didn't even know he had them. And the long story is that years later, his son, who was a lieutenant colonel in the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada himself, a serving military man, came back, and he brought back the 2 bits of wood that his father had broken off inadvertently in panic inside this church on June the 7th, and brought them back here to put on display inside the church where they still sit. And it's interesting because the description of the event, it talks about it during a bombardment, and it's not that it isn't a bombardment, just that I guess because it's a church, it's not emphasizing the rather horrific nature of what's actually happening here, which is kind of part battle, part massacre. But it doesn't change the essential essence of the wonderful story of this son bringing these bits of wood back to the church. But yeah, I wouldn't call the events here a bombardment myself, but amazing story.
Now, after the ambush on the Canadians by the 12th SS, not all of them were killed right here in the square. Some of them were taken prisoner, and they were taken to a town not far from here, to a church that is known as the Abbeyard Den. All right, well, we've moved up now to the Abbey Ardenne, and if you look behind me here, right there at that spot in the corner tower, that is the exact spot where the SS commander Kurt Meyer was observing these Canadians as they were approaching from the north. So where we started off at Hell's Corner, he could see all the way there, but the Canadians couldn't see them. And this is where pretty much they launched their ambush from. And after that terrible action in the square, this is where they brought the prisoners of war back to. So this field right here is where the 12th SS launched their assault from on the Canadians on June 7th. So you can see these poplar trees. There's some photos and footage of the Germans here in this area. So just in that direction is the Carpiquet Airport. The Canadians would have been coming right along the road there in the distance, and the Germans just cut them to pieces from this spot.
Following the fighting on June the 7th, which didn't just take place in Oti, but took place in Oti, Buran, and other villages around here, several hundred Allied prisoners of war were taken. Some of the British of the 9th, 185th Brigade were taken prisoner, and Canadians of the 9th Brigade. A lot were brought here. Now, the great majority of these prisoners were taken off to Germany in prisoner of war camps, as should have occurred based on the Geneva Convention. But 22 probably were selected for an alternative fate, and that's what we're going to be talking about when we go in here. And it seems, I use the word selected because there seemed to be some kind of process behind this, because the age range, the unit range of these particular ones they selected was a great variety. There were French-speaking Canadians, there were officers, there were enlisted men, there were infantrymen, there were engineers, there were different units, tankers, and they put these Canadians into a barn, which is the other side of the panel where there's some photographs. And on the 8th of June, the next day, at something like an hour intervals, these Canadians were taken one at a time from the other side of this building. And they were taken through this doorway here, where with a single pistol shot to the back of the head, they were shot along here. And it seems there wasn't any real planning of this, because they seemed to shoot the first guy just here by the door, not kind of allowing space. So when the next guy is brought in, he has to kind of climb over the first guy to be shot. And it seems that they were selected in age order, the oldest guy first, youngest guy last. Now, 21, 22 guys, there's different numbers of how many were involved in this, because there's one particular guy called George Pollard, whose body's never been found. So there's discrepancies exactly how many were in this group, but let's say 21. And the last guy, who was 17 years old or something, has to come over and step over the previous 18 or 19 of his dead comrades who were buried here, or shot here. And this massacre, basically, apart from the perpetrators, no one knew about this for a long time. It was only the caretakers of the abbey, the Vico family, Jacques Vico, who had been in the French resistance in World War II in another part of France. When he returns back, I think it was 1946, his mother had been living here during the occupation. The following winter, in this garden here, daffodils grew. I think it was daffodils, it might have been snowdrops, I think it was daffodils, grew in locations where they hadn't grown before. And it meant that the ground had been disturbed, and upon investigation they realised that these Canadians who had been shot here had been buried in the garden. Kurt Meyer, the German commander responsible for this, long story short, he was involved in numerous war crimes over World War II. 1940s, involved in some other horrific stuff up inland of Dunkirk. He ends up being tried for war crimes. He was given a death sentence, which was commuted to life sentence. And in the end, I think he served 8 years before release. And he, bizarrely and ironically, he ended up having a drinks distribution company in Europe, where he provided, amongst other things, so the legend goes, Coca-Cola and Perrier and cans for vending machines in Canadian NATO bases in Europe. And he would come to know Jacques Vico, the guy who'd found the graves in 1945-46, who I knew a little bit, since passed away, would say that he saw Kurt Meyer come back here in the late 1950s after his prison sentence with some of his SS buddies coming and looking at the battlefields, and Jacques Vico would come out and say, how can you come back here knowing what you did here? And he was, oh, it's just war. And you think to yourself, yeah, the just war bit is the ambush. That's military taking advantage of the situation. The callous murder at an hour interval, so you're leaving the last guy, 17 years old, maybe 4 or 5 hours, having heard the individual pistol shots before, allowing 5 hours for him to stew on that before he's shot in the back of the head by a pistol. That's not war, that's absolute callous murder.
Up here along this wall, they have the names and photos of the men who were murdered right here in this place. Men like James Bolt and George Gill, Reginald Keeping, Hugh MacDonald. All of these men were systematically murdered here by the SS. Boy, just a sad story. All right, we've got one more stop that we're going to make. Any death that happened in World War II was a tragedy, but the Abbey Ardenne massacre was just exceptionally awful. And the guys who were killed there are buried in various locations, including this spot right here at the Beny-sur-Mer Cemetery. One thing that you'll notice as you walk amongst these headstones is a lot of the dates are the same, and they aren't necessarily June 6th. So here we have one for RRA Major, June 9th, 1944. Here's S.H. Young's, June 9th, 1944. And what we're seeing here are days whenever the Canadians were pushing inland and coming up against the 12th SS. So yeah, here's one for June 7th for D.C. McDonald. You'll also see clusters of dates in this cemetery like around the 8th of July. So with the Abbeyard Den, when the 12th SS pushed the Canadians back, it took them a month to push back into that area, to the outskirts of Caen, and we start seeing the Canadians really piling up a lot of casualties in that action. So here's one for 8th of July. Here's another one from the Canadian Scottish Regiment, 8th of July. Here's another soldier who was killed 8th of July. So as the Canadians were making that push back into Caen, and you'll notice that there's not a cross on this grave, but rather a Jewish Star of David. Interesting story, in one of Paul's shows on World War II TV, they came across the story of a Jewish soldier here, and found out that he actually, it's not this guy, but he actually was resting beneath a cross. And due to that particular episode, well, wheels were set in motion to have that corrected, which I think is admirable. Here we have the final resting place of the Reverend W.L. Brown. He was a Canadian chaplain who died on June 6, 1944 at the age of 33. And he's also the only confirmed chaplain who was just flat out murdered by the German soldiers. Possibly SS, but we don't know for sure. And then down at the bottom here, it quotes the book of John, where he says, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Here's the final resting place of one of the men who was killed there at Abbey Ardenne, J.E. Bolt, the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment on June 7th, 1944, age 32. And something that is unique about the graves here is they have personal messages on there. It says, "Someday we'll understand, dear son. Sadly missed. Mother, sisters, brother." Wow. Here's one that says, "A soldier of the 1939 to 1945 war, a Canadian regiment, known unto God." So this is an unknown Canadian soldier. This is our keeping of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. Died 7th of June 1944 at the age of 21. This is another victim of the Abbey Ardenne massacre. And resting next to him was another one of these POWs who was murdered by the SS. C. Duché is how I'm going to pronounce that, of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. 7th of June 1944. And they rest next to each other in this cemetery. Well, that was the final resting place of a few of the victims of the Abbey Ardenne massacre, and the final resting place of many other men who fought and died under the flag of Canada so that the freedom that they knew might be experienced by others. Quite the place. If you ever come to Normandy, definitely make it a point to come to the Beny-sur-Mer Cemetery and some of the other places where these heroes of Normandy lay at rest.